Hello to everyone in Toronto. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you from my office in Johannesburg at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, which is known as WISER. We've been around for about 13 years and we try to do cutting-edge research on Johannesburg, on South Africa. We've worked for many years on city lives and city forms. And we were formed, in fact, on the eve of 9/11 in the United States. So we have this, I think, interesting imbrication between South African issues and global issues over the last decade or so. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you tonight, and thank you for the privilege of talking to you from Johannesburg. I'm very, very grateful to Alan and to Bruce and to others there for making this possible and for your flexibility. I don't want to deliver a keynote address. It would seem too formal, too stiff. So I'll refer to my notes, but really I want to make 3 sets of comments tonight, building on what Achille has already said. And then I'd be very happy to take your questions via Skype if that were possible later on. So Achille has pointed to a number of ideas that I want to pull forward in my remarks and to make something of, particularly as they relate to the arts and to literature and to my interest in aesthetic work, in order to try to think about your topic for today, for these 3 days in fact, affect and the city. Achille has pointed out that while we've thought of cities as localities and localities as spatial structures, we really need to start defining them more fully as structures of affect. And he encourages us to think about cities as forms of imagination. And that we find an approach that is able to draw on and elaborate on the pluralities, the intersections, the traffic, the crossings that go on in cities as we currently live and know them. So I'm really very interested, I think, to pursue what he has termed distinctions between sedimented space and traversed spaces. What are the circulatory systems, he asks, of the body of the city through which forms are moving? And these are questions, again, that he rightly points out that we might most productively ask of the urban poor, people that he characterizes as being victims of unfree mobility. I think that this work of the imagination allows people to inhabit a really very complex sense of space, which is of course not reducible to realist forms or to empirical facts. So I'm going to take up these questions in my first set of remarks below, by asking and trying to elaborate on and in part answer these kinds of questions and issues. Are there ways that we can understand making art in the city as a form of building infrastructure? Now, Abdul Malik Simone, as many of you will know, has talked about people as infrastructure in a very definitive essay on Johannesburg. And I've then elaborated in my work on that in relation to, for instance, fictions of the city. Can we think about fictional architectures of the cafe, the street, the campus, to try to invent and create public space? The questions I want to ask tonight, in collaboration with people I've been working with based in Strasbourg on a project called Play Urban Johannesburg, are questions like these. How does what is built intersect with other kinds of infrastructural projects? How do and can bodies actively inflect and transform the nature of urban space? We know that infrastructures are not just material but immaterial structures. And I think we should think of them more and more as densities, as bodily agglomerations, as compilations of things, and also about the conversion of people and things into thresholds of capacities. We could also say that the most critical infrastructure in the post-colonial metropolis is time. And there is, as Atto Quayson has so well pointed out in his recent work, and I wonder if Atto's there with you today, an excess of time that has to be corralled into work. Time, too, is that which allows people to make something out of almost nothing. So these are the issues I want to take up in my first set of remarks today, and they're questions which pertain, I think, in some respects to that phrase used by Teju Cole, which is indeed the title of his recent novel, The Open City. And the open city pulls against, as a politics and as a practice, the closed city, and the notion of what Achille has referred to as the offshore city. So I'm going to have more to say in my second set of remarks about gates, about gated communities, about the paradoxes of proximity, as well as the affect-laden prices of privacy in the closed city. And together I think these deliberations on the open city and the closed city offer highly suggestive ways of analysing the contemporary African city in ways that I will elaborate on my conclusion today. And the last set of remarks I want to make will offer some thoughts on what I'm calling the expressive turn in South African culture at present, emanating especially from this city as a form of affective politics, which has to do with the kinds of cultural figures that are moving through this city at the moment and dominating this space, but also which are returning us to the question of politics, the question which I don't think we should ever leave behind in urban studies, which is how to move forward the project of democratic experimentation in this vast and very complex 21st century of ours. So I'll close with a very firm eye on the political and come back to some of the most pressing questions in South African politics at the moment, questions which I think take us forward as we try to dissect the affective city of the present. Okay, so let me move then to my first set of remarks, which have to do with the open city. The questions I want to look at today are really questions like this. Does public space created through a process of art making become a manner of a stage? And if so, what sort of stage is it? The question of the stage, the city as a stage, the urban as a stage. Can the concept of the stage perhaps be done away with completely? These are the kinds of questions I'm thinking about with my colleagues from Strasbourg at the moment in relation to this project I mentioned earlier called Play Urban Johannesburg. And I'm wondering, if we get rid of the stage, what do we do with the audience? What happens to the spectator? And can artists effect these sorts of erasures, in fact? It is certainly in the nature of African cities to constantly undo the geometries of contemporary theatre, because they produce so many bifurcations, intersections, and unpredictable spatial logics. Perhaps we do need the concept of the stage, but the open stage. And the point there, I think, the question would be whether the stage is open enough. A closed stage is most certainly a gated community. In this gatedness, things are only open to some, to the view of some. It is a subdivision of a subdivision. It's the opposite of the street, where things are in plain sight. What can be said for sure is that there's no concept of public space in this manner of a stage or an open stage without time. And I think we have to keep coming back to time in these questions. Time is not necessarily continuous. It doesn't fold along a continuous line. It is by necessity fragmented. It's broken into pieces. The process of assembling broken pieces of time is what perhaps produces a stage for funerals, for the market, for the street, for a church. These broken pieces of time are put into circulation. Yet the capacity to assemble broken pieces of time and to put them into circulation is not equally distributed. And most poor people's struggles revolve around the making of these capacities. And then not everyone is a spectator. People's positions constantly vary from spectatorship to being a protagonist, and then from being a protagonist to a witness. And what is perhaps crucial is not the occupation of one's given position. It is the capacity to know when to shift from being a witness to being a spectator, and from a spectator to a protagonist. In other words, the capacity of knowing when to enter the stage and when to exit and why. I want to give you some examples of some of the possibilities for the open stage that are happening in the city at the moment. On my university campus, I got into a lift the other day, and there were many people in the lift, and somebody posed a question to me in the lift. It was an unusual sort of question. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I had to engage it, and everyone was listening. And I recognized after a few minutes that this was a piece of theatre in the lift, where I was being required to engage with the people around me. It was a manner of creating urban space from a very small space in the middle of a building. There's a project at Wits University at the moment run by the School of Arts where university lecturers get put on trains to Soweto, a large township just outside of this city, and they're required to stand up in the train and talk about Gandhi, about the Indian Ocean, about stylizing the self in Johannesburg at the moment. And they're required to engage their audience. Some people ignore them, others start to ask questions, others stand up and offer a small lecture of their own. And this would be an example of lectures on trains of trying to engage this shifting position, I think, between witness, protagonist, spectator, and create an open space, invent public space in the city. So I think performance, as we could think of it here, in terms of affect in the city, hardly ever has a beginning or an end. One can enter this kind of performance at any time and exit a given sequence only to reappear within another sequence. And in this sense, the stage is constantly assembled, disassembled, and reassembled. What is important is the price a person pays for entering and exiting that stage. Improvisation seems less and less possible in London, in Johannesburg, in Toronto perhaps, because of the ubiquity of the camera. If you're not where you're expected to be, you'll be checked. Everything related to improvisation is strange. It's an object for security. This is the price of social peace in public space. When you arrive in a city like Johannesburg, which everyone takes to be security city par excellence, there are nevertheless more possibilities than in some European spaces at the moment for improvisation, because there are fewer cameras in certain parts of the city, because there's not the money to buy that kind of security apparatus. What kind of theatre can we make in relation to the security camera is a question we still have to answer. I think it's very interesting that for Zygmunt Bauman, the mask is the essence of urban civility. Masks permit pure sociability, detached from their circumstances of power, malaise, and the private feelings, he writes, of those who wear them. Bauman argues that in order for cities to become sites of civility, people need to be able to occupy their public spaces as public personae without being nudged, pressed, or cajoled to take off their masks and let themselves go. But in Hillbrow, Johannesburg, something we might want to call civility, although I think it's unlikely that we do, is learned from the fact that you do not own this life, from the work of finding out who else suffers. It relates to a process in which people become someone else, in which we are undone by each other. This notion of civility is less interested in the bounded being of the mask than in being awake to what is precarious in another, or in the precariousness of life as such. And Paswani Mpe, a very young man who died early, wrote a novel that has been widely commented on called Welcome to Our Hillbrow. It's this kind of cosmopolitan embrace in the context of a massive epidemic of AIDS, for example, that I think drives the sense that we have of vulnerability, of precariousness, in a particularly Johannesburg sense. And then, what do we mean by a cultural event? Can we get away from culture as event? Could we use the notion of design as a theory of action in the city? This would mean being attentive to small shifts, not just in appearances, but in coordinates and grids. It would mean trying to find a relationship to that which we don't know. And I think this fascination constitutes the affective dimension of thinking and of being in the city. The idea of curation, which we're using more and more to think with in Johannesburg, offers a way into design, or what we could call a care for objects. And lastly, what could we make of and make from the charge of sexuality in the dynamic of urban agglomeration in a place like Johannesburg? Of a form of sexual contentiousness in the city, a reconfiguration of materiality and emotion. The sardonic play in the African city between women and men in a context of joblessness. Men are objectified, women retaliate. Relationships unfold in unpredictable ways. Love happens. Rolling contracts in which individuals enter and leave relationships more easily. This is the staging of sexuality now, and speaks to the extreme vulnerability of joblessness. Lives that are understood as simultaneously material and emotional, despite or because of profound inequalities. This is the intricate gendering of the street, the staging point of the sexual. I'd like to move to my second set of remarks now, which have to do with the closed city. The opposite in every way of the open city, although it'll be the dynamic between the two of them that I think we need to talk about towards the end. The offshore city, as Achille has said, is a city that aims at distancing itself from local conditions. It's the architectural manifestation of an economy in which profit is disentangled from the place where extraction happens. And the whole point about offshore cities is that they're created so that they don't seep into the crevices of their environment. Made of these prefabricated materials which can be reused elsewhere, replicated. In most cities we see a remarkable amount of activity, or certainly the cities on this continent that I'm familiar with, infrastructural projects, construction, pipes, palaces, malls, devices, tunnels, stadia being built. And everywhere, but focusing especially on Johannesburg, Abidjan, Kinshasa, Lagos, Luanda and Nairobi, gated residential enclaves are springing up. They're serviced by their own infrastructure. And I think that really we need to be thinking that all metropolises, are seeing a profound remaking of private property regimes through these forms of gatedness. Now, Johannesburg's townhouse complexes or gated communities really do not operate as suburbs any longer. There's no municipal relationship. There's no relationship with the state. They are landscapes, as Ivor Chipkin and other researchers at an institute called Parry here in Johannesburg show, that are really more uncanny than neoliberal. If these urban constellations preview a post-suburban landscape, both here and elsewhere, in the South African context, they are also sites of post-apartheid community, even when these forms of community are not easily recognized from the promise of non-racialism that we set out to achieve in 1994. While the strict set of rules and the lack of social interaction, the lack of affect in these complexes would seem to make them unhappy and bleak places to live, interviews done by Parry researchers show that when black residents compare them with their convivial places of origin, the distinction they draw is not between community and alienation or between warmth and coldness. The strict regulatory environment makes these estates peaceful, quiet, and safe places to live. And the comparison drawn again and again, Chipkin and other researchers show, is between community and privacy. Unlike apartheid law, which often lacked the character of law, the body corporate creates spaces of legality. People subject themselves to a regime of rules that are seen to have coherence and logic. In a context of high unemployment in which those with a regular income face constant financial demands for support, black and white middle-class South Africans enter into what Chipkin calls a common world in which racial and ethnic solidarities have not weakened, but which is associated with new patterns of sociability. It's a highly paradoxical situation. Post-apartheid modernity is being elaborated in these spaces, which have been invisible to academic and official notice, because they're such unexpected places and are rendered via unexpected means. In Chipkin's argument, they're products of an innovation in capitalist property relations, and not that of the Constitution or of government policies and actions. Spaces of order have been constituted through a regime of private property. For those who looked forward to a post-apartheid society leading towards non-racialism or socialism or participatory democracy, these are surely awkward terrains, but they are post-apartheid terrains nevertheless. One of the questions we haven't really got to yet, and which I think this project on affect in the city could reasonably get to in its Johannesburg context, are what forms and genres do such offshore cities give rise to? What is the novel without the street? The modernist novel, the post-colonial novel, has been so reliant on the street. What patterns of repetition or difference do we map now in a literary sense? What does the offshore novel look like? This is something I'm starting to talk about. I'm not going to commit myself yet, but I think these are ways in which we need to try to think about the closed city from an affective point of view, from the point of view of art and literature. The last set of remarks I want to make tonight is about something that I'm just starting to think about. It's very new work, and it's what I'm calling the expressive turn in South African culture, and it's really emerging from this city in particular, and it has everything to do with a cultural figure called Julius Malema, who is the leader of a political party which really makes an argument about economic apartheid, which I think goes right to the heart of the figurine, if you like, which is that the African National Congress, which has been in power for 20 years, has not managed to change the relations of capitalist accumulation of poverty and wealth substantially in this city. It's true that the black middle class is now bigger than the white middle class in Johannesburg, which is significant politically, psychologically, and in terms of urban affect, in all kinds of ways. But it hasn't resolved the question of racial poverty, of the black poor in this country, of those who live in shackland, dwell in shacks, and feel extraordinarily, I think, dispossessed by a political dispensation which nevertheless is and calls itself a democracy, if a volatile democracy. I'm interested in an expressive turn, as I'm defining it, which is about increasingly insulting the king in public, if you like, bringing into public life what was previously inside or out of sight or undercover, with a strong attraction to scandal. Someone like Julius Malema is increasingly bringing back into public conversation things that were hidden in the era of the TRC and of inclusivist political politics. So he talks increasingly about garden boys and tea girls to describe political foes, or to uncover what he sees as the sort of scandals of liberalism, traditional liberalism, which opposition politics in the form of the Democratic Alliance, which is led by a white South African woman called Helen Ziller, indulge in. I think this is a very important turn, as I say, because it begins to shape Malema as a very lively figure in popular culture in this city, shaped by his verbal inflation, his versatility, his visceral relationship to young people. He reminds me of Brenda Fassie, well-known singer of the anti-apartheid coalition years. And somebody called Spook and Tambo, who samples Malema's voice on his CD Mshini Wam, describes him as rude, crude, and someone who sometimes says very stupid things very bluntly, but the rest of the time tells the truth, and all the things most people have been too scared to say. So Malema is this interestingly affective figure in a city like this at the moment, who's seen to be cruel, merciful, thuggish, childish, rowdy, clever, and stupid at the same time. Do you see this expressive turn in political art, epitomized by the presidential phallus in the Zuma art scandal? Nobody cared about the fact that it was a desecration of the president's genitals. Everyone knows that his senses have run riot. Rather, they cared about why a black body, of which his still became a cipher, was still a repository of white neuroses, anxieties, phobias, and senses of estrangement in white South Africa. Why is it still a profane body? Why does it not enjoy the kind of immunity accorded to properly human bodies? So as I say, much of this undoes what now looks like the polite arguments for public intimacies in the middle decades, in the 90s and the mid-2000s. This new expressionism does something else. It distorts the political and cultural radically for affect, produces dense expressive formulae or sound bites, gets rid of the slow accretions of impressionism, and is really a form of non-realism, emphasizing extreme emotions, scandal, drama, has elements of the Baroque in it, but it's much less well-mannered than the Baroque, and it doesn't shun the violently unpleasant. It talks about black Boers, cappuccino capitalism, and many other sort of interesting sound bites which reappraise the politics of this city at the moment. There's a young artist called Mary Sibande who has made huge fiberglass and silicone casts of her own body, which are then hung on the edge of Johannesburg buildings in enormous blown up to billboard size photographs of these sculptures of domestic servants dress. You still find some of these uniforms in South African supermarkets. But inflated to outside, dresses become figures of fantasy, reminding us of Yonke Shinabari's work in London, Victorian references to the excesses of Victorian dress. The idea is really that domestic servants were often, meant to disappear into the background, to become invisible. But Sibandi's Sophie figures take up space, the city as room, and become hyper-visible. They become spectacles, especially at night, remaking what is a tradition of outsized billboard advertising in this city when they're dramatically lit up. So that Sophie, this excessive domestic servant, floats between and above buildings, disproportionate to her world, dislodged from the surfaces of the city. Now, what's very interesting to me in terms of this expressive term is that in Sibandi's most recent work, the domestic uniform is gone. It's no longer even played with. And in its place is a woman who's still hyper-visible, but who's now spilling her guts. She's purple. And out of her stomach come purple roots, tentacles, snakes, and suspended non-human entities which spill and spew out of her woman's body onto an exterior. And what spills is incoherence, multiplicity, and anguish. The interior exteriorizes itself. And the dream of Sibandi's semi-autobiographical figure, wrestling with transfiguration, is to exit herself and finally not to be like, not to resemble the domestic servants who were her mother and her grandmother. This involves loss, but more particularly the giving birth to a person who is not known, even to Sibandi herself. She says, I wanted to make something else that I've never seen before. I wanted to change her story. These purple characters are trying to move away from themselves. I want to move away from the past. She recalls the complex sense of connection she has between her huge, spilling, female sculptural figures that are hung from the buildings in this city, and a story told to her by her grandfather. When he was young, he was seriously injured and had to walk for kilometers with his intestines hanging out, holding his insides. In several recent works, Sibandi's figure of self can be seen cupping her hands across her stomach, attempting to hold in what is pouring out. So what is the political analysis of this new expressionism that we can see in the figure of Malema and we can see in Sibandi's purple figures draped over Johannesburg buildings? Of course, it's the failure of the South African government to build creatively on the extraordinary rupture and promise of 1994 and radically confront black poverty. Increasingly, there are gaps of disappointment, attempts at reciprocity, predatory instincts, often intellectual vacuity on the part of the ruling class, and the increasing technocratic sermons on service delivery or decent jobs for all. What, of course, is required is the rehabilitation of the political itself, how to produce the South African experiment in democracy, how to right historical wrongs, the relationship between personal or collective injury, and the larger problems of equality and dignity. So expressionism is a struggle over form, and the forms that elicit public passions are caricature and exaggeration. The only way to process what is happening is through affect, laughter, anger, a form and a discourse of the leak. It's difficult to elicit movement from the public at the moment, except through exaggeration. There's very little public deliberation or a Habermasian encounter of arguments. Rather, there's a form of upcycling and downcycling of the junk of post-apartheid. This is coupled with the history in this city of consumerism, of consumer objects, of really a sort of love relationship with the thing. And of course, this is about animism. It's about animating objects. Achille has written about this and spoken about this recently. How objects become animated, how subjects, and you can feel this here, desire to become objects, as objects, alive through objects, through acquisition, accumulation, becoming middle class, to have life through objects. And of course, objects carry with them the traces of their human production. They are politically animated through prior violence, stretching back into the longest history of exploitation, moving it back and forth across the Black Atlantic, South Africa and the United States, Europe. And for so long we've tried to maintain a sense in the struggle for emancipation of human subjectivity against its reduction to being a thing. This was Marxian humanism. But the age of animism reverses this thought in the becoming object as the desire of the human. And of course the problem, as John Drabinski and others have put it, is how do we do this if so much of our vocabulary and conceptual thinking turns on the resistance of our subjectivity to being turned into an object? So let me conclude on a very political note by saying that Julius Malema's economic freedom fighters is really firing the cultural imagination of young black South Africans in a city like Johannesburg. They're curious. Meanwhile, the ANC and large quarters of the city of Cape Town, the old left, try to be sort of vaguely moralizing, disapproving, haughtily contemptuous of a political party which is actually fostering a new wave of politicization and radicalization. And is trying to open, I think, a new phase marked by the possibility of the insurrection in the city. So the question really I want to conclude with is a question I mentioned at the beginning, which is how do we turn Johannesburg, and with Johannesburg as the engine of this continent, of this country, the economic powerhouse in many ways, the financial capital increasingly of this continent, into a genuine laboratory of democratic experimentation in the 21st century. I've moved a little bit away at the end from the life of the city, and it's because I can hardly see yet so close up how this politics of the new expressionism infuses exactly our theory of the city. Next week we're holding at WISER an event called Curating the Afropolitan City, New Ethnographies of Johannesburg. And we have 35 or 40 papers around car washers, hairdressers, children in the city and the Anthropocene, where we try to decipher, it seems to me, forms of this new expressionism in Johannesburg. It's incredibly close up. So I really want to end on political affect, and to end on a question as to how we reroute that through the way in which we theorize the African city at the moment. In many ways it feels like Johannesburg is drawing closer to its West African counterparts, to Lagos, to Cameroonian cities, to Abidjan. And that's the excitement of working here, that our theorizing about Johannesburg has necessarily to think through Lagos, through Luanda, through Nairobi. And we're trying to do that through open cities, closing cities, questions of consumerism, questions of political affect. And then, of course, we want to reroute those questions through to Toronto, through to New York, through to Mumbai and Miami. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'd be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.